Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. This is a journey about love, loss, and discovering that sometimes the most painful truths can lead to the most beautiful redemptions. Enjoy the story. My name is Robert Mitchell, but everyone calls me Bobby. I'm 72 years old now, and for the past 22 years, I've been living with what I thought was the most tragic coincidence of my life. You see, I buried my wife Linda on my 50th birthday, March 15th, 2002. The same day I was supposed to be celebrating another year of life became the day I said goodbye to the love of my life forever. Or so I thought. Linda was 38. When she died, beautiful, vibrant, and full of life, one moment gone the next. I was a police officer then, just 2 years away from retirement, and I thought I understood how quickly life could change. I'd seen accidents, tragedies, families destroyed in an instant, but nothing prepared me for losing Linda. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on March 14th. I remember the exact time because I was lying in bed, thinking about how we were going to celebrate my birthday the next day. Linda had gone to visit her friend Sarah across town and was driving home on the winding mountain road that connected our small town to the highway. "Officer Mitchell, this is Dispatcher Rodriguez. We need you to come to mile marker 15 on Mountain View Road. There's been an accident." "I'm off duty, Rodriguez. Can't someone else handle it?" "Sir, the vehicle registration shows it belongs to Linda Mitchell. We think you need to get down here." The drive to that accident scene was the longest 15 minutes of my life. When I arrived, I saw Linda's blue Honda Civic wrapped around an oak tree that had probably been standing there for 100 years. The car was completely destroyed, crushed beyond recognition. The coroner, Dr. Peterson, was someone I'd worked with dozens of times over the years. He pulled me aside with the gentle voice he reserved for family notifications. "Bobby, I'm so sorry. She was thrown from the vehicle on impact. The damage to the body is extensive, but we've identified her through her jewelry, her wedding ring, that necklace you gave her for your anniversary, her driver's license in her purse." I never actually saw Linda's body. Dr. Peterson strongly advised against it, saying it would be better to remember her as she was. The funeral was closed casket, and I spent my 50th birthday saying goodbye to the woman I'd planned to grow old with. For 22 years, I lived as a widower. I never remarried, never even seriously dated anyone else. How could I? Linda had been my everything. My partner, my best friend, my reason for getting up in the morning. Losing her didn't just break my heart. It shattered my entire understanding of what life was supposed to be. I retired from the police force 6 months after the accident. I couldn't focus on the job, couldn't handle other people's tragedies when I was drowning in my own. I used my pension and life insurance money to buy a small house near the cemetery where Linda was buried, and I visited her grave every single week for 22 years. "Hey, sweetheart," I'd say, sitting on the little bench I'd installed next to her headstone. "It's Bobby. I miss you more today than I did yesterday, and I know I'll miss you even more tomorrow." I talked to that headstone like Linda could hear me. I told her about my day, about changes in the neighborhood, about how much I wished she was there to see our garden bloom each spring. I brought her flowers every week, always daisies, her favorite. My friends and family worried about me. Over the years, my sister Margaret would call from Phoenix every few months, trying to convince me to move closer to her, to start dating, to live again, as she put it. "Bobby, Linda wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone," she'd say. "She'd want you to be happy," but I was convinced that I'd already had my happiness. 22 years with Linda had been more love than most people get in a lifetime. I wasn't looking for a replacement. There could never be one. Yesterday, everything I thought I knew about my life changed forever. I was sitting in my living room, the same chair where I'd spent countless evenings watching TV alone, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize from Riverside, California, about 300 miles from my home in Pine Valley. "Hello, is this Robert Mitchell?" "Yes, this is Bobby Mitchell." "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Sarah Chen. I'm a nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Riverside. I have a patient here who's been asking for you. She says her name is Linda Mitchell, and she claims you're her husband." The phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. For a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what I'd just heard. "Sir, Mr. Mitchell, are you there?" I picked up the phone with shaking hands. "I'm here, but that's impossible. My wife Linda died 22 years ago. I buried her myself. Sir, I understand this must be confusing, but this woman knows things about you that, well, she knows your full name is Robert James Mitchell, that you were a police officer in Pine Valley, that you have a scar on your left shoulder from a motorcycle accident when you were 25. She says you met her when you were injured during a foot pursuit in 1978. My blood ran cold. Those details weren't public information. The scar on my shoulder was something only Linda knew about. The story about how we met, I'd never told that to anyone except family. She's asking for you urgently," Sarah continued. "She has pneumonia and she's not doing well. She keeps saying she needs to see Bobby before it's too late, that she has to tell you the truth about what happened." I was silent for so long that Sarah asked if I was still there. "Mr. Mitchell, I know this sounds impossible, but would you consider coming to Riverside? She's in room 314 and visiting hours are until 9 p.m. I hung up the phone and sat in my chair, staring at the wall where Linda's picture had hung for 22 years. Her beautiful smile looked back at me, frozen in time from our last anniversary dinner together. Either someone was playing the cruelest joke imaginable, or the woman I'd mourned for over 2 decades was somehow, impossibly, still alive. I grabbed my car keys and headed for the door. I had to know the truth, even if it destroyed everything I thought I understood about my life. The drive to Riverside would take me 4 hours. 4 hours to prepare for the possibility that my wife, the woman I'd grieved for, visited in the cemetery and mourned every single day, might be lying in a hospital bed waiting for me. I had no idea that I was about to discover that the last 22 years of my life had been built on the biggest lie I could ever imagine. The drive to Riverside gave me 4 hours to think about Linda, about our life together, and about how impossible it was that she could still be alive. But as mile markers passed by, my mind kept returning to details that had never quite made sense about the night she died. I met Linda Parker in September 1978 when I was a 26-year-old police officer and she was a 24-year-old emergency room nurse at Pine Valley General Hospital. I'd been chasing a suspect through an alley when I tripped and dislocated my shoulder, requiring a trip to the ER that changed my life forever. Linda was working the night shift when they brought me in. She had the gentlest hands and the most beautiful brown eyes I'd ever seen. While she was treating my shoulder, we talked for hours about everything and nothing, her love of mystery novels, my dreams of someday owning a small farm, our shared fear of horror movies. "You know," she said as she finished wrapping my shoulder, "most police officers I meet are either unconscious or handcuffed to the bed. It's nice to have a conversation with one who's just clumsy." I asked her out before I left the hospital that night, and she said yes with a smile that lit up the entire emergency room. Our courtship was like something out of a movie. Linda was everything I'd never known I was looking for. Intelligent, compassionate, funny, and beautiful in a way that took my breath away every time I looked at her. She worked the night shift, I worked days. So we'd meet for breakfast at this little diner called Murphy's, where the waitresses knew our orders by heart. Linda told me she was originally from Oregon, that her parents had died in a car accident when she was 18, and that she had no other family. She'd moved to California to start fresh, she said, to build a life somewhere nobody knew her story. Sometimes it's easier to become who you want to be when you're not carrying other people's Expectations, she'd explained when I asked why she'd moved so far from home. I understood that completely. I'd grown up in Pine Valley, where everyone knew everyone, where your reputation was built on your family's history going back 3 generations. Linda's independence was part of what attracted me to her. We were married in June 1980, a small ceremony at the Methodist Church, with just a few of my fellow officers and Linda's co-workers from the hospital. Linda looked so beautiful in her simple white dress, and when she said her vows, there were tears in her eyes that I thought were tears of joy. Looking back now, I wonder if those tears meant something different. Our early marriage was blissful. We bought a small house on Maple Street with a big backyard where Linda planted a garden every spring. She grew tomatoes, green beans, and flowers, always daisies, which became my go-to gift for anniversaries and birthdays. Linda left nursing after we got married, saying she wanted to focus on building our home and maybe starting a family. For 3 years, we tried to have children without success. Linda took it harder than I did, becoming withdrawn and sad around pregnant women or families with young children. Maybe it's not meant to be, she'd say after another negative pregnancy test. Maybe some people just aren't meant to be parents. I'd hold her and tell her that we were complete, just the 2 of us, that children would be a blessing, but not a necessity for our happiness. I meant it then, and I still believe it now, but the fertility struggles changed something in Linda. She became more secretive, more private about her thoughts and feelings. She'd sometimes stare out the window for hours, lost in thoughts she wouldn't share with me. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" I'd ask. "Just wondering what life would have been like if I'd made different choices," she'd say. I assumed she was talking about her decision to leave nursing, or maybe her regrets about leaving Oregon. I never imagined she might be thinking about much. Bigger choices, much more dangerous secrets. Linda had no contact with anyone from her past, no phone calls from old friends, no letters from former neighbors, no visits from college roommates. At the time, I thought it was because of her tragic family situation, losing her parents so young, having no siblings or extended family. Now I realize it was probably because Linda Parker didn't exist before 1978. The night Linda died, or the night I thought she died, she had gone to visit her friend Sarah Chen, another nurse from the hospital. I remember being slightly surprised because Linda rarely socialized with her former co-workers, but Sarah had called earlier that day, asking if Linda could come over to help with some personal problem. "I'll probably be late," Linda said as she kissed me goodbye. "Sarah's going through a rough time with her divorce and she needs someone to talk to." "Drive carefully on that mountain road," I told her. "It's supposed to rain tonight." Those were the last words I ever spoke to my wife, or so I thought. The accident happened around 10:30 p.m., according to the police report. A jogger found the wreckage around 11:15 p.m. and called 911. By the time I arrived at the scene, Linda's body had already been removed and taken to the coroner's office. Dr. Peterson explained that the body had been thrown from the car and was severely damaged, making visual identification impossible. But Linda's purse was found in the wreckage with her driver's license, credit cards, and the pearl necklace I'd given her for our 5th anniversary. Her wedding ring was still on her finger. Sometimes in accidents this severe, we have to rely on personal effects for identification, Dr. Peterson had explained. But there's no doubt this is your wife. The funeral was 3 days later. I stood beside that closed casket and said goodbye to the woman I'd loved for 22 years, never imagining that she might still be breathing somewhere else. For 22 years, I lived with the guilt of our last conversation being so ordinary. I wished I'd told her I loved her one more time, wished I'd held her longer, wished I'd insisted on driving her to Sarah's house myself. Now, driving through the California night toward a hospital where a woman claiming to be Linda was waiting. For me, I had to consider the possibility that my guilt had been based on a lie. If Linda was alive, where had she been for 22 years? Why had she let me believe she was dead? And most importantly, what truth was she so desperate to tell? Me before it was too late? As I pulled into the parking lot of Mercy General Hospital, I realized that I was about to get answers to questions that would either heal 22 years of heartbreak or destroy what was left of my sanity. The woman in room 314 was either my wife or someone playing the cruelest joke in history. I was about to find out which. The elevator ride to the third floor of Mercy General Hospital felt like the longest 30 seconds of my life. My hands were shaking as I walked down the hallway, reading room numbers 310, 312, 314. I stopped outside the door, unable to bring myself to look inside. What if it was Linda? What if 22 years of grief had been for nothing? What if it wasn't her, and I was about to have my heart broken all over again by someone's cruel mistake? I took a deep breath and looked through the window into room 314. My legs nearly gave out. It was Linda, older, thinner, her brown hair now streaked with grey, but unmistakably the woman I'd married 44 years ago. She was sleeping, connected to oxygen and IV lines, but her face was exactly as I remembered it, just aged by the 22 years I thought she'd been dead. I stood in that doorway for several minutes, trying to convince myself this was real. The woman in that bed had the same small scar above her left eyebrow from when she'd fallen off her bicycle as a child. She had the same beauty mark on her neck that I used to kiss every morning before work. This was Linda. My Linda, alive. I knocked softly on the doorframe, and her eyes opened immediately. When she saw me, her face crumpled with an emotion I couldn't identify. Relief mixed with guilt, joy mixed with terror. "Bobby," she whispered, her voice exactly as I remembered it. "You came." I walked into the room on unsteady legs and sat in the chair beside her bed. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. 22 years of separation compressed into a space too small for either of us to understand. "Linda, how is this possible? I buried you. I went to your funeral. I've been visiting your grave. Every week for 22 years. Tears started streaming down her face. "Bobby, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to you, what I put you through. I wanted to tell you the truth so many times, but I couldn't. I couldn't risk your life. My life." "Linda, what are you talking about?" She tried to sit up, but was too weak from the pneumonia. "Bobby, everything I told you about my past was a lie. My name isn't Linda Parker. My parents didn't die in a car accident. I'm not from Oregon." I felt like the room was spinning. "What do you mean?" "My real name is Isabella Rossi. My father was Vincent Rossi, and he was a very dangerous man, a criminal." The name Vincent Rossi was familiar. I searched my memory and realized why. He'd been a major organized crime figure in the Pacific Northwest during the late 1970s and early 1980s. I'd read about his trial and conviction in the police bulletins. "Linda, are you telling me your father was Vincent Rossi, the money laundering case?" "Yes, and Bobby, I was the one who testified against him. The pieces of a puzzle I didn't know existed started falling into place. Linda's secretiveness about her past, her lack of contact with family, her nervousness whenever I talked about my police work. I was in the Federal Witness Protection Program when I met you. My handler thought Pine Valley would be a safe place for me to start over, that a small-town police officer would be good cover for my new identity." "You were using me." "No!" Linda's voice was stronger than it had been since I'd arrived. "Bobby, falling in love with you wasn't part of any plan. It just happened, and it was the most real thing in my life. But I couldn't tell you the truth without putting you in danger. Linda, if you were in witness protection, how did you end up dead? What happened that night?" She closed her eyes, and I could see her gathering strength for what she was about to tell me. In 2002, my father's associates found me. They discovered where I was living, who I'd married. My FBI handler told me they were planning to kill both of us, to send a message to other potential witnesses. So the accident was staged. The FBI helped me fake my death to protect both of us. They used a body from the morgue, someone who died in an unrelated accident. They put my jewelry on her, placed my identification in the wreckage. I stared at the woman who had been the center of my world for 22 years, trying to process what she was telling me. Linda, you let me believe you were dead for 22 years to protect me. I didn't have a choice, Bobby. It was either fake my death or watch both of us get murdered. I chose to lose you rather than lose your life. But why didn't you contact me later? Why didn't you tell me the truth once the danger was over? Linda's face crumpled again. Because I was a coward. Because the longer I waited, the harder it became to explain. Because I thought you'd moved on, found someone else, built a new life. Linda, I never moved on. I never even dated anyone else. I've spent 22 years mourning you. The pain in her eyes was unbearable. I know, I've been watching you from a distance. I know you visit my grave every week. I know you never remarried. Bobby, I've been dying a little bit more each day, knowing what my choice cost you. You've been watching me? Not directly, but I've had ways of checking on you. I know you retired early. I know you moved to the house near the cemetery. I know you've been alone all these years. The knowledge that Linda had been alive and aware of my suffering while I grieved for her was almost too much to bear. Linda, where have you been? What have you been doing for 22 years? Living in Riverside under the name Margaret Santos, working as a nurse again, trying to build some kind of life while missing you every single day. I reached out and took her hand, the hand I'd held for 22 years of marriage, the hand I'd thought I'd never touch again. Linda, I don't understand how the FBI could just let you disappear from my life without any explanation. They told you I was dead. As far as they were concerned, Linda Mitchell died in that car accident. Isabella Rossi was relocated and given a new identity. But I was a police officer. I could have been trusted with the truth. Bobby, my handler, said the fewer people who knew the truth, the safer everyone would be. Even within the FBI, only a handful of people knew what really happened. I sat, holding Linda's hand, trying to reconcile 22 years of grief with the reality that she'd been alive and suffering too. Linda, are you telling me that all this time, while I've been visiting your grave and talking to your headstone, you've been living 300 miles away, knowing I thought you were dead? Yes. And Bobby, it's been the worst torture imaginable. I've wanted to contact you so many times, but I didn't know how to explain. I didn't know how to justify what I'd done to your life. So why now? Why are you telling me this now? Linda looked at the machines monitoring her condition, at the IV lines keeping her hydrated. Because I'm really dying this time, Bobby. The pneumonia isn't responding to treatment the way it should, and I couldn't die for real without telling you the truth, without asking for your forgiveness. I squeezed her hand tighter. Linda, you don't need my forgiveness. You saved my life. I destroyed your life. I took away 22 years of happiness because I was too scared to trust you with the truth. You were trying to protect me. I was trying to protect myself from having to watch you die because of my past. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us crying, both of us trying to understand how we'd gotten to this moment. Bobby, there's something else I need to tell you. Something that will hurt even more. I looked at her, wondering what could possibly be more devastating than what I'd already learned. What is it, Linda? I wasn't alone all these years. Bobby, we have a daughter. The room started spinning again. What? I was pregnant when I faked my death. I didn't know until after the accident was staged. I've been raising our daughter alone. For 22 years, everything I thought I knew about my life had just changed again. I had a wife who'd been alive for 22 years, and I had a daughter I'd never met. I stared at Linda, trying to process her words. A daughter. We had a daughter who was 22 years old, who I'd never met, who didn't even know I existed. Her name is Emma, Linda continued, her voice weak, but determined to tell me everything. Emma Santos. She's a nurse, just like I was when we met. She works here at this hospital. She works here? Linda? Does she know about me? She knows her father's name was Robert Mitchell, and that he was a police officer who died before she was born. I told her you died in the line of duty. So our daughter had grown up believing both her parents were dead in different ways. Her father killed as a hero, her mother dead for 22 years. Bobby, Emma is beautiful. She has your eyes and your stubborn streak. She's been taking care of me since I got sick, and she's the one who convinced me to call you. She knows you called me. She doesn't know you're alive. She thinks I'm delirious from the pneumonia, talking about a dead husband. But Bobby, she needs to know the truth. She's spent her whole life feeling incomplete, wondering about the father she never knew. I tried to imagine what it would be like to meet a 22-year-old daughter who thought I was dead. Linda, how do we even begin to explain this to her? Very carefully and together, if you're willing. The door to the room opened, and a young woman in scrubs walked in. I knew immediately it was Emma. She had Linda's brown hair and my blue eyes, Linda's delicate features and my height. She was absolutely beautiful, and she was my daughter. "Mom, how are you feeling?" Emma asked, checking Linda's IV lines with the professional efficiency of an experienced nurse. "Your oxygen levels are looking better." She glanced at me, sitting in the visitor's chair. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had a visitor." Linda looked at me, asking silently if I was ready for this moment. "Emma, sweetheart, I need you to sit down. There's something I need to tell you." Emma pulled up another chair, her expression concerned. "Mom, you need to rest. The doctor said you shouldn't have too many visitors while you're fighting this infection." "Emma, this is Bobby Mitchell." Emma looked at me politely, not understanding the significance of the name. "Emma, this is your father." The color drained from Emma's face. She looked back and forth between Linda and me, trying to make sense of what her mother had just said. "Mom, Dad died before I was born. You told me he was killed in the line of duty. I lied to you, sweetheart. I've been lying to you your whole life, and I'm so sorry." Emma stood up abruptly, backing away from both of us. "What are you talking about? This doesn't make sense." I spoke for the first time since Emma had entered the room. "Emma, your mother and I were married for 22 years. We lived in Pine Valley, where I was a police officer and she was a nurse. I thought she died in a car accident in 2002. That's impossible. My mother's name is Margaret Santos. She's lived in Riverside my entire life." Linda's voice was getting weaker, but she pushed through her exhaustion to explain. "Emma, my real name is Linda Mitchell. I had to fake my death and assume a new identity to protect your father from dangerous people who wanted to hurt our family." Emma sat back down heavily, staring at both of us like we'd lost our minds. "You're telling me that my dead father is sitting right here and my mother has been lying to me about everything my entire life?" "Yes," Linda said simply, "and I know how impossible it sounds." Emma looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "If you're really my father, prove it." I reached into my wallet and pulled out the photograph I'd carried for 22 years, a picture of Linda and me at our wedding. Emma studied it carefully, seeing her mother 22 years younger, seeing me as a young man who shared her. Facial features, this could be fake, she said, but her voice was uncertain now. "Emma," I said gently, "your mother has a small scar above her left eyebrow from falling off her bicycle when she was 7 years old. She has a beauty mark on the right side of her neck. She's afraid of horror movies, but loves mystery novels. Her favorite flowers are daisies. Emma looked at Linda, seeing details that only someone who'd known her intimately would know. Emma, you have a birthmark on your left shoulder that looks like a crescent moon, Linda said. Bobby, she got that from you. You have the same birthmark in the same place. Without thinking, I rolled up my sleeve and showed Emma the birthmark I'd had since birth. She pulled down her scrub top slightly and revealed an identical mark in the same location. This is insane, Emma whispered. This is absolutely insane. Emma, I know this is overwhelming, I said. I'm still trying to process it myself. 24 hours ago, I thought your mother was dead, and I had no idea you existed. 24 hours ago, I thought both my parents were dead, and I was alone. In the world. We sat in silence for several minutes, all three of us trying to understand how we'd gotten to this moment. Emma, Linda said finally, I know you're angry with me for lying to you your whole life, but I need you to understand that every choice I made was to protect the people I loved. You protected him by letting him think you were dead for 22 years. Emma's voice was rising with anger and confusion. I protected him by making sure he wasn't murdered by my father's enemies. Emma turned to me. And you just accepted that she was dead? You never investigated, never questioned anything. Emma, I was a police officer. I saw the accident scene. I talked to the coroner. I attended the funeral. I had no reason to think it was anything other than a tragic accident. But you never remarried. Never had other children. No. Your mother was the love of my life. I couldn't imagine being with anyone else. Emma looked back and forth between us, seeing 22 years of pain and love and sacrifice that had led to this impossible moment. So what happens now? She asked. Do we just pretend to be a normal family after all this? Emma, Linda said, I don't know what happens now. I just know that I couldn't die without both of you knowing the truth. Emma stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where she'd grown up believing she was alone in the world. I need some time to process this, she said finally. I need to think about what you've told me. Of course, I said. This is a lot for anyone to handle. Emma turned back to us. But I want you both to know I'm glad you're alive. Both of you. I've spent my whole life wondering what it would be like to have a real family. As Emma left the room to return to her shift, Linda and I sat holding hands, both of us realizing that we now had something we'd never expected, a chance to build a family together, even after 22 years of separation. But first, we had to figure out how to heal from 22 years of lies, grief, and missed opportunities, and we had to hope that our daughter could forgive us for the childhood we'd stolen from her through our choices. Over the next 3 days, while Linda's condition slowly improved, she told me the complete truth about her past, truths that were more complicated and dangerous than I'd ever imagined. Linda had grown up as Isabella Rossi in Portland, Oregon, the daughter of Vincent Rossi, who ran money laundering operations for several crime families on the West Coast. To the outside world, Vincent was a successful businessman who owned restaurants and construction companies. To Isabella, he was a father who worked late, had dangerous friends, and lived in a house with security systems that most people didn't need. I knew something was wrong from a young age, Linda explained, as we sat together in her hospital room. Other kids' fathers didn't have bodyguards. Other families didn't get threatening phone calls in the middle of the night. Isabella had tried to live a normal life, despite her father's criminal activities. She'd excelled in school, trained as a nurse, and planned to move away from Portland as soon as she graduated. But at 24, she witnessed something that changed everything. I came home from work early one night in March 1978. I was supposed to be working a double shift, but they'd sent me home because the hospital was overstaffed. When I walked into our house, I saw my father and 2 of his associates beating a man to death in our living room. The man being killed was Tommy Castellano, an accountant who had been skimming money from Vincent's operations. Isabella watched from the stairway as her father and his men tortured Tommy for information about where the missing money was hidden, then killed him when he couldn't provide satisfactory answers. Bobby. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes watching my own father commit murder. When they were done, they wrapped Tommy's body in plastic and carried him out to a van. I ran upstairs and pretended to be asleep. The next morning, Isabella read in the newspaper that Tommy Castellano had been reported missing by his family. She realized that she was the only witness to his murder, and that her testimony could put her father in prison for life. For weeks, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function normally. I kept thinking about Tommy's wife and children, how they would never know what happened to him. Isabella contacted the FBI and offered to testify against her father in exchange for protection and a new identity. The federal agents were initially skeptical. Children rarely testified against their own parents in organized crime cases. But Isabella provided details about Vincent's operations that only someone with inside access could know. The hardest part wasn't deciding to testify. The hardest part was accepting that I would have to give up everything, my name, my history, my entire identity, to do the right thing. The trial lasted 6 months. Isabella testified under heavy security, with U.S. Marshals protecting her around the clock. Vincent Rossi was convicted of murder, racketeering and money laundering and sentenced to life in prison without parole. When the verdict was read, my father looked directly at me and mouthed the words, "You're dead to me." I knew he meant it literally. After the trial, Isabella entered the Federal Witness Protection Program. She was relocated to Pine Valley, California, given the identity of Linda Parker, and provided with a complete background story about being an orphan from Oregon. The U.S. Marshal who handled my case was named Thomas Warner. He told me that Pine Valley was perfect because it was small enough that strangers would be noticed, but large enough that a new nurse wouldn't be suspicious. He said dating a local police officer would provide additional security. So when you met me, was that part of the plan? Bobby, meeting you was completely accidental. I was working in the ER because I needed a job, not because I was following some federal script. When you came in with that dislocated shoulder, I was attracted to you immediately. Linda explained that she'd reported our relationship to her handler, who had initially been concerned about her getting romantically involved with anyone, especially a police officer who might ask too many questions about her past. But Thomas Warner eventually decided that our relationship was good cover. A married nurse living a quiet life in a small town was the perfect way to disappear. Linda, when did you tell Warner you were pregnant with Emma? I didn't. I found out about the pregnancy 3 months after I faked my death. By then, I was already living as Margaret Santos in Riverside, and I was terrified to contact anyone from my previous life. Linda had given birth to Emma alone, using her new identity and claiming that the father had died before the baby was born. She'd raised our daughter as a single mother while maintaining the fiction that both Robert Mitchell and Linda Mitchell were dead. Bobby, every day for 22 years, I've wondered if I made the right choice. I've wondered if I should have trusted you with the truth, if I should have given you the option to face the danger with me. Why didn't you? Because I'd already lost my entire family by testifying against my father. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you too, especially if it was my fault. Linda's eyes filled with tears as she continued her story. There's something else, Bobby. Something I found out years later that makes everything even worse. What do you mean? Linda closed her eyes, gathering strength for what she was about to tell me. My father died in prison in 2015. Bobby, he'd been dead for 9 years, and I didn't even know. The threat that forced me to fake my death stopped existing almost a decade ago, and I was still hiding from ghosts. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Linda, are you telling me that you could have contacted me 9 years ago, that we could have had 9 years together? I didn't know he was dead, Bobby. No one told me. I was completely cut off from any information about my father or his associates. I was living in isolation, thinking I was still in danger. But surely your FBI handler would have told you when the threat was over. Linda's expression became even more pained. Thomas Warner retired in 2010. His replacement was supposed to check in with me annually, but no one ever contacted me. I thought that meant the danger was still active, that I needed to maintain my cover indefinitely. I stared at Linda, trying to process the magnitude of what she was telling me. We'd lost not just 22 years, but at least 9 years unnecessarily. Linda, who was your new handler? Why didn't they inform you about your father's death? I don't know. I never heard from anyone after Warner retired. I assumed that no news was good news, that contacting me would only happen if there was a new threat. So, you've been living in fear for 9 years based on a danger that didn't exist. Yes. And Bobby, that's not even the worst part. I couldn't imagine what could be worse than learning we'd wasted an additional 9 years based on bureaucratic incompetence. What's the worst part? Emma has been asking questions about her father since she was old enough to talk. She's always felt incomplete, always wondered what you were like, what kind of man you were. 2 years ago, she started trying to research you online. What did she find? Nothing initially, but Emma is persistent and she's smart. She eventually found newspaper articles about your retirement from the police force, about your wife, Linda Mitchell, dying in a car accident. My blood ran cold. Emma knows I'm alive. Emma discovered that Robert Mitchell, Pine Valley police officer, retired in 2002 and was still alive as of 2022. She found your address, Bobby. She's known for 2 years that her supposedly dead father was living 300 miles away. Why didn't she contact me? Because she couldn't understand why I had lied to her about your death. She confronted me about it last year, and I panicked. I told her that you had abandoned us, that you knew about her but chose not to be part of her life. The pain of Linda's words was indescribable. Not only had I missed my daughter's entire childhood, but she'd spent the last 2 years believing I had deliberately abandoned her. Linda, how could you tell her that? Because I was a coward, because telling her the truth would have meant admitting that I'd stolen 22 years from both of you, because I was terrified that you'd both hate me for what I'd done. So Emma has spent 2 years thinking I abandoned her? Yes, and Bobby, that's why she's been so angry and distant with me. She can't understand how her father could know about her existence and choose not to be part of her life. I understood now why Emma had been so suspicious when Linda introduced me as her father. She'd already known I was alive, but she'd believed I was a man who had chosen to abandon his child. Linda, when Emma walks back into this room, she's going to think I'm the father who knew about her but didn't care enough to find her. I know, and I have to tell her the truth about that too. Over the next hour, Linda explained the complete scope of her deceptions to our daughter. Not just the lies about my death, but the lie about my abandonment, the truth about witness protection, and the reality that I'd spent 22 years believing both she and Emma were dead. But as Linda talked, I realized there were still questions that didn't have answers. Questions about why her FBI protection had ended so abruptly, why no one had informed her about her father's death, and why she'd been left to live in unnecessary fear for almost a decade. Linda, I think we need to contact the FBI. I think we need to find out what happened to your protection and why you were abandoned by the system that was supposed to keep you safe. Bobby, what if stirring this up puts us in more danger? Linda, you just told me the original threat has been dead for 9 years. Whatever danger we're facing now, it's not from your father's organization. As Linda's condition continued to improve, I realized that our reunion was just the beginning of a much more complex story. We had 22 years of lost time to account for, a daughter who had every reason to distrust both of us, and a federal system that had apparently failed in its duty to protect the people it had sworn to help. But most importantly, we had each other again. And for the first time in 22 years, I had hoped that our story might have a happy ending after all. The question was whether Emma would be willing to forgive us for the childhood we'd stolen from her, and whether we could build a real family from the wreckage of 2 decades of lies and missed opportunities. As Linda's strength returned over the following days, she was able to give me more details about the night I thought she died. Details that were both fascinating and heartbreaking in their complexity. The plan to fake Linda's death had been developed quickly in early March 2002, when Thomas Warner received intelligence that Vincent Rossi's associates had located Linda and were planning to eliminate both of us within days. Thomas came to our house on March 12th while you were at work, Linda explained. He told me that intercepted communications showed a contract had been put out on both of us, and that we had maybe 48 hours before they moved. Warner had given Linda 3 options: enter witness protection again, with a new identity, accept federal protection in place with round-the-clock security, or fake her death and disappear completely. I asked about the second option, having protection while staying with you. Thomas said it would mean armed guards, safe houses, bulletproof cars, the complete destruction of any normal life we might have together. Linda had chosen the third option because she believed it was the only way to ensure my safety while giving her a chance to disappear completely. Thomas explained that your being a police officer actually made the plan more complicated. You would investigate any suspicious details about my death, so everything had to be perfect. The body used in the car wreck belonged to Jane Morrison, a homeless woman who had died of a drug overdose earlier that week. Jane was approximately Linda's age and build, and her body had been in the county morgue awaiting burial in the Potter's field. Thomas said they would dress Jane in my clothes, put my jewelry on her, and stage the accident to make identification through physical features impossible. Linda, how did they get your personal items? Your wedding ring, your necklace? I gave them to Thomas that morning. Bobby, taking off my wedding ring was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Linda had spent March 14th, what she knew would be her last day as Linda Mitchell, trying to memorize every detail of our house, our life together, our 22 years of marriage. I sat in our kitchen for hours, looking at the pictures on the refrigerator, trying to memorize your face. I packed one small bag with a few personal items, but I had to leave everything else behind. The plan required Linda to be away from home when the accident occurred, which is why she had called Sarah Chen and asked to visit that evening. Sarah was part of the plan, Bobby. She was a federal agent posing as a nurse. I didn't know that until years later. Linda had driven to a safe house 20 miles outside of Pine Valley, where Thomas Warner was waiting with a team of agents and a coroner who was cooperating with the operation. At 10:30 p.m. they staged the accident. They put Jane's body in my car, dressed in my clothes and wearing my jewelry, then sent the car down the embankment into that oak tree. And you watched this happen? I had to. Thomas said I needed to see it myself so I would understand that Linda Mitchell was really dead, that there could never be any contact with my previous life. Linda described watching from a distance as emergency responders arrived at the scene, as my fellow officers secured the area, as the coroner examined the body that everyone believed was hers. Bobby, the hardest part was knowing you were on your way to the scene. I wanted to run to you, to tell you it was all fake, to beg you to come with me wherever I was going. Why didn't you? Because Thomas had shown me photos of what Vincent's people did to witnesses and their families. because I'd rather have you hate me for dying than have you die because of my past. After the staged accident, Linda was immediately transported to a safe house in Nevada, where she remained for 6 weeks, while federal agents created her new identity as Margaret Santos. Those 6 weeks were the worst of my life. I was completely isolated, completely cut off from any information about how you were handling my death. I begged Thomas to let me know if you were okay, but he said any contact or information could compromise the operation. Linda was eventually relocated to Riverside, California, with a complete background as Margaret Santos, a widowed nurse from Arizona who was starting over after her husband's death. The irony was cruel, Bobby. In my new identity, I was a widow, grieving a dead husband, just like you were a widower grieving a dead wife. Linda, during those first weeks and months, did you ever consider telling me the truth? Every single day, I would drive to phone booths and dial our number, then hang up before it could ring. I wrote you hundreds of letters that I never sent. Linda pulled a small notebook from her bedside table drawer. I've kept a journal for 22 years, writing letters to you that I never mailed. She opened the notebook to a random page and read, March 15th, 2003. Dear Bobby, today is the first anniversary of my death and your 51st birthday. I know you're probably at my grave right now, and I'm sitting in a parking lot outside Pine Valley, watching you from a distance. You look so sad, so lost. I want to run to you and tell you I'm alive, but I know that would destroy the sacrifice I made to keep you safe. Tears were streaming down both our faces as Linda continued reading entries from different years. Birthdays she'd observed from a distance, holidays she'd spent alone while knowing I was alone too, moments when she'd almost broken and contacted me. Linda, you've been watching me for 22 years. Not constantly, but regularly. I would drive to Pine Valley maybe 4 times a year just to see that you were okay. I knew when you retired, when you moved to the house near the cemetery, when you started going grey. I never saw you. I was very careful. And Bobby, I wasn't stalking you. I was just checking on the only person in the world who mattered. To me, Linda showed me photographs she'd taken over the years, pictures of me leaving the grocery store, working in my yard, visiting her grave. She documented 22 years of my life from a distance, like a ghost haunting her own memory. This one is from 2015, she said, showing me a photo of myself placing flowers on her grave. I took it from the parking area across the street. You sat there for 2 hours that day, talking to my headstone. Looking at these photographs, I realized that Linda had suffered as much as I had during our separation. While I'd been grieving a wife I thought was dead, she'd been watching me grieve while being unable to comfort me. Bobby, there were so many times I almost approached you. Times when you looked so sad that I wanted to risk everything just to hold you for 5 minutes. What stopped you? Fear. Fear that you'd hate me for what I'd done to your life. Fear that bringing me back from the dead would hurt you more than losing me had. As Linda finished telling me about the 22 years we'd lost, I realized that our separation had been a tragedy for both of us, but also an act of love. Linda had sacrificed her own happiness to protect mine, even though the cost had been devastating for both of us, but I also realized that understanding what had happened was only the first step toward healing. We still had to figure out how to build a future together after 2 decades of separation, and how to help our daughter forgive us for the childhood we'd taken from her. The woman I'd loved for 22 years was alive, but we were essentially strangers now, shaped by 2 decades of different experiences and separate grief. The question was whether love could bridge 22 years of separation, or whether some losses were too great to ever fully recover from. By the end of Linda's first week in the hospital, her pneumonia was responding well to treatment, but my questions about her FBI protection were growing more urgent. Too many things about her situation didn't make sense, and I was starting to suspect that Linda's isolation hadn't been the result of bureaucratic oversight. I decided to do what I'd learned to do during 30 years as a police officer: investigate. My first call was to the FBI field office in Los Angeles, where I asked to speak with someone about the witness protection program. After being transferred several times, I reached Agent Maria Rodriguez, who specialized in witness security issues. Agent Rodriguez, my name is Robert Mitchell. I'm trying to get information about my wife, who was in witness protection from 1978 to 2002. Mr. Mitchell, I can't discuss specific cases or participants in the witness protection program. Agent Rodriguez, my wife faked her death 22 years ago as part of the program, and I just discovered she's been alive this entire time. I think there may have been some breakdown in communication about her case. There was a long pause. Mr. Mitchell, can you provide me with some basic details, the participant's name and approximate dates of involvement? I gave Agent Rodriguez all the information Linda had provided about her time as Isabella Rossi and her relocation as Linda Parker. Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to need to research this case and call you back. Can you provide a contact number? 2 days later, Agent Rodriguez called with information that made my blood run cold. Mr. Mitchell, I've reviewed the case file for Isabella Rossi. According to our records, her protection was officially terminated in 2010 when her handler, Thomas Warner, retired. What does that mean, officially terminated? It means she should have been contacted and informed that federal protection was ending and given the option to maintain her new identity or reclaim her original identity. Agent Rodriguez, my wife, was never contacted. She's been living in isolation for 14 years, thinking she was still under protection. That's not supposed to happen. Participants are always notified when protection ends, especially if the original threat has been neutralized. Agent Rodriguez promised to investigate further and arranged to meet with Linda and me at the hospital the following day. When Agent Rodriguez arrived, she was accompanied by Agent David Chen, who specialized in internal investigations of witness protection failures. Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you about your last contact with Thomas Warner, Agent Chen began. Linda explained that Warner had visited her in Riverside in December 2010, supposedly for a routine check-in, but had seemed distant and rushed. He told me that everything was fine, that I should continue maintaining my cover as Margaret Santos, and that someone would contact me within a year if anything changed. And no one ever contacted you? No. After 2010, I never heard from anyone. Connected to the FBI again, Agent Chen and Agent Rodriguez exchanged glances that suggested they knew something Linda and I didn't. Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you something directly, and I want you to think carefully about your answer. During your time under protection, did Thomas Warner ever behave inappropriately toward you? Linda's face went pale. What do you mean? Did he ever make romantic advances, suggest that your marriage to Mr. Mitchell was a cover that could be ended, or indicate that he had personal feelings for you? Linda was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her thinking back through years of interactions with Warner. There were a few times when Thomas seemed overly interested in my personal life. He asked detailed questions about my marriage, about whether I was happy, about whether I missed my life before witness protection. Did he ever suggest that you might be better off without your previous life? Yes. After I faked my death, he told me several times that I was free to become anyone I wanted to be, that I didn't have to be limited by my past relationships or commitments. Agent Chen took detailed notes about Linda's interactions with Warner over the years. Mrs. Mitchell, did Warner ever suggest that your husband had moved on, that he had remarried or was involved with someone else? Yes. In 2015, he told me that Bobby had started dating a woman from his church, that he seemed happy and had adjusted well to widowhood. I stared at Linda in shock. Linda, that was completely false. I never dated anyone. I never even considered it. Agent Rodriguez spoke up. Mrs. Mitchell, did you ever attempt to independently verify information that Warner gave you about your husband? No. I trusted that the FBI was monitoring Bobby as part of my protection. Thomas said it was dangerous for me to try to research my past life independently. Agent Chen closed his notebook and looked at both of us with an expression of professional concern mixed with personal sympathy. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I believe you've been the victims of a serious abuse of authority within the Witness Protection Program. What kind of abuse? I asked. We've been investigating Thomas Warner for the past 18 months. He's suspected of manipulating several witness protection cases for personal reasons. Agent Rodriguez continued the explanation. Warner had a pattern of becoming emotionally involved with female participants in the program. In some cases, he prolonged their protection unnecessarily. In others, he provided false information to keep them isolated from their previous lives. Are you saying that Warner deliberately kept Linda away from me because he had feelings for her? That's what we're investigating. Mr. Mitchell, according to our records, Vincent Rossi died in federal prison in 2015. Your wife should have been notified immediately and given the option to reclaim her life. Linda grabbed my hand tightly. Bobby, that means we lost 7 additional years because of Thomas Warner's lies. Agent Chen nodded grimly. Mrs. Mitchell, Warner told you that your husband was dating someone else in 2015, the same year your father died, and your protection should have ended. We believe he deliberately prevented you from learning about your father's death to keep you dependent on him. Where is Warner now? I asked. That's part of our investigation. Warner retired in 2010, but continued to maintain contact with several former participants, including your wife. We believe he was operating outside official channels. Agent Rodriguez added more disturbing details. Mr. Mitchell, Warner also filed false reports suggesting that you had been investigated as a potential security risk. These reports indicated that you might be compromised by criminal associates. What does that mean? It means Warner created a paper trail suggesting that contacting you would put your wife in danger, even after the original threat was eliminated. The magnitude of Warner's betrayal was becoming clear. He hadn't just failed to protect Linda. He had actively worked to keep us separated for his own personal reasons. Agents, what can be done about this? Can Warner be prosecuted? We're building a case against him for abuse of authority, falsification of federal records, and psychological manipulation of protected witnesses. Your wife's case is one of several. We're investigating. Agent Chen gave us his business card. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, we'll need detailed statements from both of you about Warner's conduct and the impact his actions had on your lives. This information will be crucial for our investigation. As the agents left, Linda and I sat in her hospital room, trying to process what we'd learned. Not only had we lost 22 years to a necessary protection operation, but we'd lost additional years to one man's selfish manipulation of the system designed to keep Linda safe. Bobby, Warner stole our lives. He stole years we could have had together. Linda, what matters now is that we know the truth. We can't get those years back, but we can make sure Warner faces consequences for what he did. But even as I comforted Linda, I was thinking about our daughter Emma, who had grown up without a father because of Warner's lies. Emma had spent 22 years feeling incomplete, and now she would learn that at least some of those years were stolen by a federal agent's personal obsession. The question was whether knowing the truth about Warner's betrayal would help our family heal, or whether it would just add another layer of anger and betrayal to an already complicated situation. Agent Chen called us 3 days later with information that changed everything we thought we knew about Thomas Warner and his manipulation of Linda's case. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, we've located Thomas Warner. He's been living in Nevada under an assumed name, and we believe he's been in contact with several former witness protection participants. What kind of contact? I asked. The kind that suggests he's been running an unauthorized protection operation, convincing women that they're still in danger when they're not. Linda gripped my hand tighter. Agent Chen, are you saying that other women have been manipulated the same way I was? We've identified at least 4 cases where Warner continued contact with female participants after their official protection ended, providing false information about ongoing threats to keep them isolated and dependent on him. Agent Chen explained that Warner had been terminated from the FBI in 2012, 2 years after his supposed retirement, when supervisors discovered irregularities in his case management. But by then, he'd already established unauthorized contact with former participants, and he continued operating as if he still had federal authority. Agent Chen, I need to ask you something directly, I said. Was Warner planning to harm Linda, or was he just trying to control her? Based on our investigation, we believe Warner was obsessed with your wife and saw her as his ideal woman. Someone who was grateful for his protection and isolated from other relationships. Agent Rodriguez had more disturbing details. Mr. Mitchell, Warner kept extensive files on you, including photographs, employment records, and personal information gathered through unauthorized surveillance. He was watching me. For over 20 years, he monitored your life to make sure you weren't moving on or trying to investigate your wife's death. Linda was crying now, understanding the full scope of how she'd been manipulated and controlled. Agents, can we meet with Warner? Can we confront him about what he did to our lives? Agent Chen hesitated. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, Warner has agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for reduced charges. He's willing to meet with you, but I want you to understand that this conversation will be difficult. We need to hear what he has to say, Linda said. I need to understand why he destroyed our family. 2 days later, we drove to the federal building in Los Angeles, where Thomas Warner was being held pending charges. The man who walked into the interview room looked nothing like the confident federal agent Linda remembered from 22 years. Warner was 68 years old, gray-haired, and had the defeated appearance of someone whose entire life had collapsed around him. Isabella, he said when he saw Linda, you look exactly the same. My name is Linda, she replied coldly. It's been Linda for over 40 years. Warner turned to me with an expression that mixed guilt with something that might have been jealousy. Officer Mitchell, I've been watching you for a very long time. Agent Warner, I want you to explain to my wife and me why you stole 22 years of our lives. Warner was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with how to justify his actions. I saved her life, he said finally. Isabella was in real danger, and I protected her. Thomas, my father died in 2015, Linda said. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were safe where you were. You had built a good life as Margaret Santos. Why disrupt that for a relationship that might not work out? Because it was my choice to make. Linda's voice was rising with anger. You had no right to decide what was best for my life. Warner looked at Linda with an expression that revealed the obsession that had driven his 22 years of manipulation. Isabella, you were perfect in Riverside. You were safe, independent, successful. You didn't need anyone else. I needed my husband. I needed my daughter to know her father. Your daughter was better off without the complications of a reunited family. She was thriving with just you. I spoke up, trying to control my anger. Warner, you convinced my wife that I had moved on, that I was dating other women. Why? Because I thought it would help her move forward. I thought if she believed you were happy, she could focus on her own happiness. But that wasn't your decision to make. Warner stared at the table, avoiding eye contact with both of us. I cared about Isabella. I wanted her to be safe and happy. You wanted her to be dependent on you, Linda said. You wanted to be the only person in her life who mattered. That's not true. Agent Chen, who had been observing the conversation, spoke up. Mr. Warner, we have recordings of phone calls you made to Mrs. Mitchell where you explicitly discouraged her from trying to contact her husband. I was protecting the integrity of the witness protection program. You were protecting your own. Access to a woman you were obsessed with. Warner finally looked directly at Linda. Isabella, I loved you. I've loved you for 25 years. Everything I did was because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. You never had me to lose. Linda's voice was filled with decades of suppressed anger. I was never yours. I was always Bobby's wife, even when I thought he was better off without me. But you could have been happy with me. We could have built a life together. Based on lies and manipulation. That's not love, Thomas. That's obsession. I looked at this man who had destroyed our family for his own selfish reasons and felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Warner, you stole 22 years from Linda and me, and 22 years from our daughter's life with her father. How do you justify that? I thought I was protecting people I cared about. You were serving yourself, Linda said. You were using federal authority to control a woman who never wanted to be controlled. Warner was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I know I was wrong. I know I destroyed something beautiful between you two. But Isabella, you have to understand, I was alone. You were alone. And I thought maybe we could be alone together. I was never alone, Linda said. I carried Bobby with me every day for 22 years. I carried our love, our memories, our commitment to each other. You couldn't take that away from me, no matter how hard you tried. As we left the federal building that day, Linda and I both felt a strange sense of closure. We finally understood exactly what had been done to us and why. But understanding Warner's motivations didn't give us back the years we'd lost. Bobby, do you think we can ever really heal from this? Linda, we're going to have to try. We can't. Let Warner steal our future the way he stole our past. But healing would require more than just understanding what had happened to us. It would require rebuilding trust with our daughter, who had every reason to be angry with both of us for the childhood we'd failed to give her. The hardest work was still ahead of us. Emma had been avoiding us for 3 days after our meeting with Thomas Warner, processing everything she'd learned about the FBI agent who had manipulated our family for over 2 decades. When she finally returned to Linda's hospital room, she brought news that would change our understanding of the situation completely. Mom, I need to show you something, Emma said, pulling out her laptop. I've been doing research about Thomas Warner, and I found something disturbing. Emma had used her access to medical databases and public records to investigate Warner's background more thoroughly than the FBI agents had shared with us. Mum, Thomas Warner has a pattern going back to the 1980s. He's been involved in at least 8 witness protection cases involving women, and in every case he maintained unauthorized contact long after official protection ended. Linda moved closer to look at Emma's screen, which displayed newspaper articles, court records, and missing person reports spanning 4 decades. Emma, what exactly did you find? I found 3 other women who were in witness protection under Warner's supervision. All 3 disappeared from their protected locations within 2 years of being placed. My blood ran cold. Disappeared? Sarah, Kellerman, protected witness from 1983 to 1985, vanished from her apartment in Phoenix with no forwarding address. Jennifer Martinez, protected witness from 1989 to 1991, last seen leaving her job at a hospital in Denver. Rebecca Chen, protected witness from 1995 to 1997, disappeared from a grocery store parking lot in Portland. Emma showed us photographs of the 3 women, all young, all attractive, all bearing a resemblance to Linda. Emma, are you suggesting that Warner kidnapped these women? I'm suggesting that Warner has been using the witness protection program to identify and isolate vulnerable women for over 40 years. Linda stared at the photos of the missing women, seeing herself reflected in their faces. Bobby, I could have been one of them. If I hadn't had Emma to anchor me to reality, if I hadn't been strong enough to resist whatever Warner was planning. Emma continued her presentation with more disturbing discoveries. Mum, I also found records showing that Warner purchased property in Nevada in 1998, a compound with multiple buildings, high security, completely isolated. What kind of compound? The kind where someone could keep people against their will while convincing them they were being protected. Emma showed us satellite photos of Warner's Nevada property, a large house surrounded by smaller buildings, all enclosed by high fences and security systems. The FBI raided this property 2 days ago as part of their investigation. They found living quarters for at least 6 women, all with locks on the outside of the doors. The implications of what Emma was telling us were horrifying. Warner hadn't just been manipulating witness protection cases. He'd been using federal authority to abduct and imprison women. Emma, were any of the missing women found at the compound? 2 of them were, Sarah Kellerman and Jennifer Martinez. They'd been held there for over 30 years, convinced that leaving would result in their deaths. Linda grabbed my hand tightly. Bobby, that could have been me. If I'd been more vulnerable, if I'd trusted Warner completely. But you weren't. Vulnerable, I said. You were strong enough to maintain your own identity, even when Warner was trying to control you. Emma nodded. Mom, the FBI agents told me that your case was different from the others because you never fully trusted Warner. You maintained emotional connections to Dad and your previous life, which made you harder to manipulate completely. What about Rebecca Chen? Was she found? Emma's expression became sad. Rebecca died in 2019. She'd been at the compound for 22 years, but she never gave up hope that her family would find her. The room fell silent as we processed the magnitude of what Warner had done to multiple families over 4 decades. Emma, how did you find all this information? Because I spent 2 years believing that my father had abandoned me, I learned how to research people thoroughly. When you told me the truth about Warner, I used those same skills to investigate him. Linda looked at our daughter with a mixture of pride and sadness. Emma, you've been searching for answers about our family for years, haven't you? Since I was 16. I knew something didn't make sense about Dad supposedly dying before I was born, then being alive in Pine Valley. I just didn't understand what was really happening. Emma pulled up another document on her laptop. Mom, there's something else. I found records showing that Warner visited you in Riverside much more frequently than you remembered. What do you mean? Hospital security footage, credit card records, gas station receipts. Warner was in Riverside at least once a month for the past 14 years. Linda's face went pale. That's impossible. He only visited me every few years. No, Mom. He was watching you constantly. He had surveillance equipment installed near your apartment, monitoring your daily activities. Emma showed us photographs from Warner's seized files, images of Linda going to work, shopping for groceries, taking Emma to school events. Mom, Warner documented your entire life as Margaret Santos. He knew your schedule, your friends, your habits. He was obsessed with controlling every aspect of your existence. The depth of Warner's surveillance and control was more extensive than any of us had realized. Emma, did Warner ever try to contact you directly? That's the most disturbing part. He did contact me, but I didn't know who he was. Emma explained that beginning when she was 18, she'd received occasional phone calls from someone claiming to be conducting research about children of deceased parents. The caller asked detailed questions about my relationship with you, whether I ever felt curious about my father, whether I'd tried to research his death. Emma, you were talking to Warner? Apparently, he was monitoring my emotional state, probably trying to determine if I was becoming a threat to his control over Mom. Linda was crying now, understanding how completely Warner had invaded every aspect of our lives. Bobby, he didn't just steal our marriage. He was planning to control Emma, too. Emma closed her laptop and looked at both of us with an expression that combined anger with determination. Mom, Dad, Warner didn't just make mistakes or act out of misguided love. He's a predator who used federal authority to kidnap and imprison women for decades. What happens to him now? He's facing charges for kidnapping, false imprisonment, abuse of authority, and multiple other crimes. Based on what the FBI found at his compound, he'll probably spend the rest of his life in prison. As Emma finished explaining her research, I realized that our situation was even more complex than I'd understood. We weren't just victims of bureaucratic incompetence or romantic obsession. We were survivors of a systematic criminal operation that had destroyed multiple families over 4 decades. Emma, I need to ask you something. How do you feel about your mother and me now that you know the complete truth? Emma looked at both of us for a long moment before answering. I'm angry that I lost 22 years with my father. I'm sad that Mum suffered alone for so long, but I'm proud that you both survived something that destroyed other families. And can you forgive us for the choices we made? Dad, Mum made an impossible choice to protect you. You spent 22 years grieving. A woman you thought was dead. Neither of you did anything wrong. The person who needs forgiveness is Thomas Warner, and he doesn't deserve it. Emma's words brought a sense of relief I hadn't expected. Our daughter understood that we had all been victims of Warner's manipulation, not willing participants in a deception. Emma, what happens now? How do we move forward as a family after everything that's been revealed? We start over, Emma said simply. We can't get back the years we lost, but we can make sure the years ahead are different. Linda spoke up from her hospital bed, her voice stronger than it had been since I'd arrived. Emma, Bobby, I need to tell you both something. Learning about Warner's compound, about the other women he kidnapped and imprisoned, has made me realize something important. What's that? I asked. I was never really free during those 22 years. I thought I was living independently, as Margaret Santos, but Warner was controlling my life just as completely as if he'd locked me in a room. Emma nodded. Mom, you were a victim of psychological imprisonment. You were told you couldn't contact Dad, couldn't research your past, couldn't make independent decisions about your life. But now I am free, Linda continued. For the first time since 1978, I'm completely free to choose what I want to do with my life. And what do you choose? And I asked. Linda looked at me with the same love I'd seen in her eyes 46 years ago when we first met. I choose you, Bobby. I choose our family. I choose to spend whatever years we have left together. Emma smiled for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. Then that's what we'll do. We'll be a family. Over the next week, as Linda's health continued to improve, we made plans for our future together. Linda would be discharged from the hospital and would come home with me to Pine Valley, where we would rebuild our life together. Emma requested a transfer to Pine Valley General Hospital, where she could continue her nursing career while living close to both her parents for the first time in her life. I want to get to know my father, she told the hospital administrator. I've waited 22 years for this opportunity, but even as we made plans for the future, we knew that healing from 22 years of separation would take time. Linda and I were essentially strangers who shared a deep love and a lifetime of memories, but who had been shaped by 2 decades of different experiences. Bobby, I need you to know that I'm not the same person I was when I died in 2002, Linda said, as we prepared for her discharge. I know. And I'm not the same person either. We've both been changed by what we've experienced. Are you worried that we won't be able to reconnect? I took her hand and looked into the brown eyes that had been the center of my world for 22 years of marriage and 22 years of mourning. Linda, I've loved you every day for 44 years. I loved you when you were alive. I loved you when I thought you were dead, and I love you now that I know the truth about what happened to us. Even after everything, even knowing that I chose to let you suffer rather than trust you with the truth. Especially because of that. You saved my life, Linda. You sacrificed your own happiness to protect mine. That's not something I need to forgive. It's something I need to honor. Linda squeezed my hand tightly. Bobby, do you think we can really build a future together? Do you think we can overcome 22 years of separation? I think we can try, and I think the love that survived 22 years of separation is strong enough to overcome anything. As we left the hospital together, Linda, Emma and I, walking out as a family for the first time in 22 years, I realized that our story wasn't ending. It was finally beginning. We had lost 2 decades to lies and manipulation, but we had the rest of our lives to build something real and lasting. Together, the most important thing wasn't the years we'd lost, but the love we'd found again. During Linda's final day in the hospital, she asked Emma and me to sit with her while she shared something she'd been holding back, the complete emotional cost of the 22 years we'd been separated. Bobby, Emma, I need you both to understand what those years were really like for me. Not just the facts about where I lived and what I did, but what it felt like to live with the choices I made. Linda pulled out the journal she'd shown me earlier, but this time she opened to different pages, entries that revealed the depth of her suffering over 2 decades. January 15th, 2005. Dear Bobby, Emma turned 3 today. She asked me why she doesn't have a daddy like the other children at daycare. I told her that her daddy was a hero who died protecting people, but what I wanted to say was that her daddy is alive and wonderful and would love her more than life itself if he knew she existed. Emma's eyes filled with tears as Linda continued. Reading, March 15th, 2010. Dear Bobby, today marks 8 years since I died. I drove to Pine Valley and watched you visit my grave from across the cemetery. You brought daisies like you always do, and you sat there for 2 hours talking to my headstone. I wanted to run to you so badly that I had to grip the steering wheel to keep myself in the car. Linda turned to another page, her voice breaking. As she read, June 12th, 2015. Dear Bobby, Emma graduated from high school today. She was valedictorian, just like her father would have been proud to see. But when they called for family photos, it was just her and me. She tried to hide it, but I could see the sadness in her eyes when she watched other students with both their parents. I robbed her of that moment, and I robbed you of the pride you should have felt. Linda looked directly at Emma. Sweetheart, every milestone in your life was both a joy and a heartbreak for me. I was so proud of everything you accomplished, but devastated that your father couldn't share those moments. Mum, why didn't you ever try to contact us, even just to let us know you were alive? Because I was a coward, Emma, and because Thomas, Warner had convinced me that any contact would put both of you in danger. Linda showed us more journal entries that revealed how Warner had systematically undermined her confidence and independence over the years. October 3rd, 2018, Thomas visited today and told me that Bobby was seeing someone from his church, a widow named Patricia, who makes him smile again. He said Bobby seemed happier than he'd been in years. I should be glad that he's found someone, but I feel like I'm dying all over again. I stared at Linda in shock. Linda, that was completely false. I've never dated anyone named Patricia. I've never dated anyone at all. I know that now, but for 6 years I believed you had moved on and found someone else. Linda explained how Warner's lies had convinced her that staying away was actually an act of love, that disrupting my apparent happiness would be selfish. Thomas was very clever about it. He never said I couldn't contact you. He just made me believe that contacting you would hurt you more than help you. Mum, what about me? Did Warner ever tell you that I was better off without a father? He told me that you were thriving as an independent young woman, that having a father suddenly appear in your life would create confusion and instability. Emma shook her head in anger. Mom, I spent my entire childhood feeling incomplete. I used to lie awake at night, wondering what my father was like, whether he would have been proud of me, whether I inherited any of his personality traits. Linda's journal contained entries about watching Emma struggle with the absence of a father, about birthdays and holidays, when Emma would ask questions about the father she'd never known. May 8th, 2020. Emma asked me today if I thought her father would have liked her boyfriend David. She's 26 years old and still seeking approval from a man she's never met. I wanted to tell her that her father would adore anyone who makes her happy, but instead I said I'm sure he would be proud of her choices. Linda, reading these entries, I can see how much you suffered. But I need to ask you something directly. Did you ever consider that I might be suffering too? Linda closed the journal and looked at me with tears streaming down her face. Every day, Bobby, I thought about your pain every single day. But I had convinced myself that your suffering would be temporary, that eventually you would heal and move on. But I never moved on. I know that now. But at the time, I thought that letting you grieve and heal was kinder than telling you the truth and forcing you to live with the knowledge that I was alive but couldn't be with you. Emma spoke up. Mum, you made that choice for all of us. You decided what was best for Dad and for me without asking what we actually wanted. You're right, Emma. I was so focused on protecting you both from physical danger that I didn't consider the emotional damage I was causing. Linda explained how the isolation had affected her own mental health over the years. I suffered from severe depression, especially during your childhood, Emma. There were times when I considered ending my life because the guilt and loneliness were unbearable. Mom, why didn't you get help? Because getting help would have meant talking about my past, and Thomas had convinced me that any revelation about my true identity would put all of us in danger. Linda had lived for 22 years without any genuine emotional support, carrying the weight of her sacrifice alone while watching her daughter grow up and her husband grieve from a distance. Bobby, the hardest part wasn't missing you, although that was terrible. The hardest part was knowing that I had chosen to cause you pain. Every time I saw you at my grave, every holiday you spent alone, every birthday you marked without celebration, I knew that your suffering was my fault. Linda, your suffering was Warner's fault, not yours. But the choice to fake my death was mine. Warner presented options, and I chose the one that I thought would keep you safe, even though I knew it would break your heart. Emma reached over and took Linda's hand. Mom, you were 28 years old, pregnant and terrified. You made the best decision you could with the information you had. But I could have chosen differently. I could have trusted your father. With the truth, I thought about what Linda was saying, about the impossible choice she'd faced 24 years ago. Linda, if you had told me the truth in 2002, what do you think would have happened? I don't know. Maybe we would have faced the danger together. Maybe we would have been killed together. Maybe we would have found a way to survive together. And now that you know the truth about Warner's manipulation, do you think the choice would have been different? Linda was quiet for a long time, considering the question. If I had known that Warner was lying about ongoing threats, if I had known that he was manipulating the situation for his own purposes, if I had known that you would spend 22 years alone rather than moving on, yes, I would have chosen differently. Mom, Emma said, you can't punish yourself for making the wrong choice when you were working with false information. But I can take responsibility for the consequences of that choice. Emma, I robbed you of your childhood with your father. Bobby, I robbed you of 22 years of happiness. Those are facts that I have to live with. I looked at this woman who had sacrificed everything to protect me, who had lived in emotional isolation for over 2 decades rather than risk my safety. Linda, you didn't rob me of 22 years of happiness. You gave me 22 years of life. If you hadn't made the choice you made, I might have been dead long ago. But was it worth it? Was your safety worth the cost of all that suffering? Linda, I can't answer that question for you, but I can tell you that I would rather have you alive and suffering than dead and at peace. Emma nodded. Mum, the sacrifice you made was real, and the cost was enormous. But it kept our family alive when it could have been destroyed completely. Linda wiped her eyes and looked at both of us. I need you both to know that despite everything, despite the loneliness, the guilt, the years of separation, I would make the same choice again if it meant protecting your lives. And we need you to know, I said, that we understand why you made that choice, and we don't need you to apologize for choosing love over convenience. As Linda's discharge day ended and we prepared to go home together as a family, I realized that understanding Linda's sacrifice was crucial to our ability to move forward. She hadn't abandoned us or chosen to hurt us. She had chosen to save us at enormous personal cost, then lived with the consequences of that choice for 22 years. The question now was whether we could honor her sacrifice by building a future worthy of everything she had given up to make it possible. 3 days after bringing Linda home to Pine Valley, we received a phone call that would add another layer of complexity to our already extraordinary situation. Agent Chen called with news about the FBI's investigation into Thomas Warner. That none of us had expected. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, we need to meet with you urgently. There's been a development in the Warner case that affects your family directly. Agent Chen and Agent Rodriguez arrived at our house that evening with files and photographs that revealed information about Warner's activities that went far beyond what we'd already learned. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, during our search of Warner's property in Nevada, we found extensive records documenting his surveillance and manipulation of your family over the past 22 years. Agent Chen opened a thick folder containing hundreds of photographs, documents, and recordings. Warner didn't just monitor your wife's life in Riverside. He was also conducting surveillance on you, Mr. Mitchell, and he had been in direct contact with your daughter Emma for several years. Linda and I exchanged alarmed glances. What kind of contact? Mr. Mitchell, do you remember receiving any unusual phone calls over the past few years? Calls from someone claiming to be conducting research or surveys? I thought back through recent years, trying to remember anything that had seemed out of place. Actually, yes, there have been several calls from someone claiming to be researching the long-term effects of spousal loss. I always hung up because I didn't want to discuss Linda's death with strangers. Those calls were from Thomas Warner. He was monitoring your emotional state and gathering information about your daily life. Agent Rodriguez continued with even more disturbing revelations. Mrs. Mitchell, Warner also had contacts inside the hospital where you work in Riverside. He was receiving regular reports about your health, your work performance, your social interactions. How is that possible? Warner maintained his federal credentials illegally for several years after his termination. Hospital staff believed he was conducting legitimate government research. But the most shocking discovery was about Emma. Ms. Mitchell, Warner approached you directly on several occasions over the past 5 years, posing as different people. Emma looked confused. I don't understand. I never met Thomas Warner. Agent Chen pulled out photographs showing Emma at various locations around Riverside, her apartment complex, her favorite coffee shop, the hospital where she worked. Do you remember a man named David Chen who claimed to be a medical researcher studying nurse retention rates? Emma's face went pale. Yes, he interviewed me twice, asked detailed questions about my job satisfaction and personal life. That was Thomas Warner using a false identity. What about Dr. Robert Santos, the physician who claimed to be researching genetic factors in nursing aptitude? Also Warner. He was gathering psychological profiles on you to determine if you posed a threat to his control over your mother. Emma sat down heavily, realizing that she'd been manipulated and studied without her knowledge. How many times did Warner approach me? We've documented at least 8 different interactions over 5 years, using various false identities and pretexts. Linda grabbed Emma's hand. Sweetheart, he was researching all of us, trying to understand our personalities and vulnerabilities. Agent Rodriguez pulled out another set of documents that revealed the most disturbing aspect of Warner's long-term plan. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, we believe Warner was preparing to escalate his control over your family. What do you mean? Warner had been developing a plan to relocate your wife to his Nevada compound, using fabricated threats to convince her that her life was in immediate danger. Agent Chen showed us detailed maps and timelines that Warner had created for what appeared to be a kidnapping operation. Warner was planning to stage an attack on your mother's apartment, Agent Chen told Emma. He would then rescue her and convince her that the only way to stay safe was to disappear completely to his protected facility. The implications were terrifying. Warner had been preparing to abduct Linda under the guise of protecting her, just as he had done with other women over the years. When was this supposed to happen? I asked. Based on the documents we found, Warner was planning to execute this operation within the next 6 months. Linda was shaking as she processed what she'd been told. Bobby, if I hadn't gotten sick, if Emma hadn't convinced me to call you, Warner might have succeeded in kidnapping me. Mrs. Mitchell, your pneumonia and subsequent hospitalization actually saved your life. Warner's plan required you to be alone and vulnerable in your apartment. Emma spoke up with a realization that changed our understanding of recent events. Agent Chen, my mother's pneumonia wasn't natural, was it? What do you mean? I mean, did Warner somehow cause her illness to create the opportunity for his rescue scenario? Agent Rodriguez consulted her notes carefully. Ms. Mitchell, that's an interesting theory. The doctors treating your mother noted that her pneumonia was unusually severe for someone of her age and health status. Is it possible that Warner poisoned? We're having her medical records reviewed by specialists to determine if there were any unusual factors in her illness. The possibility that Warner had deliberately made Linda sick to facilitate his kidnapping plan added another level of horror to what he had done to our family. Agent Chen, what evidence do you have about Warner's specific plans for my wife? Agent Chen showed us detailed floor plans of Linda's apartment building, schedules of her daily activities, and scripts Warner had written for the phone calls he would make during his fake rescue operation. Warner had been planning this operation for over 2 years. He knew your wife's routines, her vulnerabilities, her emotional triggers. What would have happened if he had succeeded? Based on what we found at his compound, Warner would have convinced your wife that she needed to disappear completely, that both you and Emma were in immediate danger if she maintained any contact with you. Linda was crying now, understanding how close she had come to being imprisoned by the man she'd trusted for over 20 years. Bobby, I would have disappeared forever. You and Emma would never have known what happened to me. Emma held her mother tightly. Mom, you're safe now. Warner is in custody, and he can't hurt any of us anymore. But Agent Rodriguez had one more piece of information that would change our perspective on the entire situation. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, there's something else you need to know. Emma's decision to research her father and ultimately convince her mother to call him wasn't entirely her own idea. What do you mean? Emma asked. Warner had been manipulating you to encourage exactly that outcome. That's impossible. I made my own decision to research Dad. Ms. Mitchell, Warner wanted your mother to contact your father because he was planning to use that reunion as part of his kidnapping scenario. Agent Chen explained Warner's complete plan. Convince Linda to reunite with me, allow us a brief period of happiness, then stage a massive threat that would require Linda to disappear forever to protect both Emma and me. Warner believed that having experienced reunion and hope, your mother would be more willing to sacrifice herself again to protect her family. The manipulation was so complex and long-term that we were all struggling to understand its full scope. Agent Chen, are you telling us that everything that's happened, Emma's research, Linda's call to me, our reunion, was part of Warner's plan? The emotions and love are real, Mr. Mitchell, but the circumstances that brought you together were orchestrated by Warner to serve his own purposes. As the agents left that evening, Linda, Emma, and I sat together, trying to process what we'd learned. Bobby, does it matter that Warner manipulated the circumstances of our reunion if the reunion itself is genuine? Linda, I don't care how we found each other again. I only care that we did. Emma nodded. What matters is that we're together now, and Warner can't hurt us anymore. But even as we comforted each other, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we'd come to losing Linda forever, and how Warner's manipulation had extended even to the circumstances of our reunion. The question was whether knowing the truth about Warner's plans would help us heal, or whether it would add another layer of violation to everything we'd already endured. 2 weeks after learning the full scope of Thomas Warner's manipulation, we received word that his trial would begin in 3 months. Agent Chen explained that our testimony would be crucial to ensuring Warner faced appropriate consequences for his decades of crimes. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, Ms. Mitchell, the prosecution wants all 3 of you to testify about Warner's impact on your family. Your case is one of the most well-documented examples of his systematic abuse of authority. But preparing for the trial meant reliving 22 years of separation and manipulation in excruciating detail. Linda would have to explain her decision. To fake her death, I would have to describe the decades of grief and isolation, and Emma would have to detail growing up without a father because of Warner's lies. Are we ready to put ourselves through that? Linda asked as we discussed the trial preparation. Linda, if our testimony helps prevent Warner from doing this to other families, then yes, we're ready. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, explained that Warner was facing multiple charges that could result in life imprisonment. Warner is charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, abuse of federal authority, identity theft, and conspiracy. Your family's case demonstrates the long-term impact of his crimes. But preparing for trial also meant confronting questions about our own choices and the decisions we'd made over the years. Mrs. Mitchell, the defense will likely argue that you chose to remain separated from your family, that Warner didn't force you to maintain your false identity. Linda had been dreading this aspect of the trial. How do I explain that Warner's manipulation was so complete that I believed I was making free choices when I was actually being controlled? We'll work with you to demonstrate the psychological tactics Warner used to maintain control over your decisions. Emma had her own concerns about testifying. Ms. Mitchell, you'll need to explain how growing up without your father affected your development and your sense of identity. I can do that. But I also want to make sure the jury understands that Dad is a good man who would have been an excellent father if he'd been given the chance. Over the next month, we spent countless hours with prosecutors, FBI agents, and psychological experts, preparing our testimony and reviewing the evidence against Warner. But the trial preparation also gave us opportunities to understand our own experiences more clearly. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist working with the prosecution, helped us understand the psychological techniques Warner had used to control Linda's decisions. Mrs. Mitchell, Warner used a combination of isolation, false information, and emotional manipulation to convince you that you were making independent choices when you were actually responding to carefully crafted scenarios. Dr. Chen, how is that different from normal persuasion? Normal persuasion involves presenting accurate information and allowing people to make informed decisions. Warner systematically provided false information and created artificial consequences to force the decisions he wanted. Dr. Chen's analysis helped Linda understand that she had been a victim of psychological abuse, not a willing participant in family separation. Linda, you didn't choose to stay away from us for 22 years. You were manipulated into believing that staying away was the only way to protect us. But the trial preparation also revealed how strong our family bonds had remained despite decades of separation. Mr. Mitchell, your decision to never remarry, to visit your wife's grave weekly for 22 years, demonstrates the depth of your love and commitment. Ms. Mitchell, your persistent research into your father's background shows that children need connections to both parents, regardless of circumstances. Mrs. Mitchell, your decision to call your husband when you thought you were dying proves that true love survives even the most sophisticated manipulation. As the trial date approached, we also had to make decisions about our future as a family. Bobby, after the trial is over, what do we want our life to look like? Linda had been living with me in Pine Valley for 6 weeks, and we were slowly rebuilding our relationship. But we were both aware that we were essentially starting over after 22 years of separate experiences. Linda, I want us to have the life we planned before Warner destroyed it. I want us to grow old together, to be grandparents together, to make up for as much lost time as possible. Emma had been dividing her time between her job at the Riverside Hospital and visits to Pine Valley, but she was preparing to relocate permanently to be closer to both her parents. I want to live near both of you. I want to have the family relationship I never had growing up, but we also had to acknowledge that healing from 22 years of trauma would take time. Dr. Chen, how do we rebuild trust and intimacy after such a long separation? Very carefully and with realistic expectations. You're not the same people you were 22 years ago, and your relationship will need to develop based on who you are now, not who you were then. Linda and I had started couples counseling to help us navigate the complexities of reuniting after such a long separation. The love is still there, our counselor Dr. Martinez explained. But you need to rebuild practical intimacy, learning each other's current habits, preferences, and perspectives. Is it realistic to expect that we can have a normal marriage after everything that's happened? Define normal, Dr. Martinez said. Your marriage will be different from what it would have been without the separation, but it can still be loving, committed, and fulfilling. Emma was also working with a therapist to process growing up without a father and the complex emotions of suddenly having a complete family at age 24. The hardest part isn't adjusting to having a father, Emma told me. The hardest part is realizing how much I missed by not having you in my life growing up. Emma, we can't change the past, but we can make sure the future is different. I know. And Dad, I want you to know that getting to know you has been the best experience of my adult life. As we prepared for the trial that would hopefully bring justice for Warner's crimes, we were also preparing for a future that none of us had expected to have. The trial would be difficult, but it would also mark the end of Warner's control over our lives and the beginning of our new life as a complete family. Linda, are you ready to face Warner in court? I'm ready to make sure he never hurts another family the way he hurt ours. Emma, are you prepared to tell the jury about growing up without your father? I'm prepared to make sure Warner understands the cost of his manipulation. As the trial approached, we knew that the hardest part of our ordeal was still ahead of us. But we also knew that we would face it together as a family for the first time in 22 years. The trial of Thomas Warner began on a cold Monday morning in November 2024. As Linda, Emma, and I walked into the federal courthouse in Los Angeles, I felt the weight of 22 years of separation and manipulation pressing down on all of us. Warner was already seated at the defense table when we entered the courtroom. He looked older and more frail than he had during our confrontation months earlier, but his eyes still held the calculating intelligence that had allowed him to manipulate our family for over 2 decades. When Warner saw Linda enter the courtroom, his expression changed to something that made my blood run cold. Not remorse or shame, but a twisted kind of satisfaction, as if he was pleased to see her one final time. "Mum, don't look at him," Emma whispered. "He doesn't deserve any of your attention." Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh began her opening statement by explaining the scope of Warner's crimes to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, over the course of this trial, you will hear about a federal agent who used his authority not to protect witnesses, but to kidnap and control them for his own personal gratification." Walsh outlined how Warner had manipulated at least 6 different witness protection cases over 4 decades, focusing specifically on our family's experience as the most extensively documented example of his systematic abuse. You will hear from Linda Mitchell, who was convinced to fake her own death and live in isolation for 22 years while her husband grieved and her daughter grew up without a father. The defense attorney, Martin Russo, argued that Warner's actions were misguided attempts to protect witnesses from real threats. Thomas Warner devoted his career to protecting people whose lives were in danger. His methods may have been unorthodox, but his motivations were always to keep vulnerable people safe. But when the prosecution began presenting evidence, the true scope of Warner's manipulation became undeniable. Agent Rodriguez testified about the Nevada compound where Warner had held multiple women against their will, showing photographs of the locked rooms and surveillance equipment. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic psychologist, explained the psychological techniques Warner had used to control his victims. Mr. Warner employed classic manipulation tactics: isolation, false information, manufactured crises, and the creation of dependency relationships. These are the same techniques used by domestic abusers and cult leaders. On the second day of trial, Linda took the witness stand. Walsh guided her through the story of her life as Isabella Rossi, her decision to testify against her father, and her entry into witness protection. "Mrs. Mitchell, when you agreed to fake your death in 2002, what did you believe would happen to your husband?" "I believed he would grieve for me, but that eventually he would heal and rebuild his life. I thought the pain would be temporary." "Did Agent Warner tell you that your husband would be monitored to ensure his well-being?" "He told me that the FBI would keep track of Bobby to make sure he wasn't becoming a security risk, but that no one would provide him with information about my survival." Walsh then walked Linda through Warner's lies over the years. The false reports about my dating other women, the fabricated updates about Emma's well-being, the manufactured threats that kept Linda isolated long after her father's death. "Mrs. Mitchell, when did you first suspect that Agent Warner might not be telling you the truth?" "In 2020, when Emma started asking questions about her father. She was so persistent, so determined to understand why her father had supposedly abandoned her, that I began to wonder if Warner's explanations made sense." The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal. Russo tried to paint Linda as a willing participant who had chosen isolation over family responsibility. "Mrs. Mitchell, no one forced you to remain separated from your family. You could have contacted your husband at any time, couldn't you?" "I was told that contacting him would put his life in danger." "But you never independently verified that information, did you?" "I trusted that the FBI was telling me the truth." "Isn't it true, Mrs. Mitchell, that you enjoyed the freedom of your new identity?" that you liked being able to start over without the obligations of marriage and motherhood. Linda's response was firm and clear. Mr. Russo, I loved my husband, and I wanted nothing more than to be with him and raise our daughter together. Every day of separation was torture. On the third day, I testified about the 22 years of grief and isolation I'd experienced. Mr. Mitchell, how did losing your wife affect your life? It destroyed everything I thought I knew about happiness and purpose. Linda was the center of my world, and losing her felt like losing my reason to exist. Walsh had me describe the weekly visits to Linda's grave, the photographs I'd kept of our life together, the complete inability to consider relationships with other women. Mr. Mitchell, did you ever suspect that your wife might still be alive? Never. I was a police officer. I saw the accident scene, spoke with the coroner, attended the funeral. I had no reason to think it was anything other than a tragic accident. The defense tried to suggest that my devotion to Linda's memory was unhealthy, that I should have moved on and rebuilt my life. Mr. Mitchell, don't you think 22 years of mourning is excessive? Don't you think your wife would have wanted you to find happiness with someone else? Mr. Russo, my wife was the love of my life. I couldn't imagine being with anyone else, and I saw no reason to try. On the fourth day, Emma testified about growing up without a father. Ms. Mitchell, how did not having a father affect your childhood? I felt incomplete my entire life. I would see other children with their fathers and wonder what I was missing, what kind of man my father had been, whether he would have been proud of me. Emma described the research she'd done to learn about me, the confusion when she discovered I was alive, and the anger she'd felt when she believed I had abandoned her. Ms. Mitchell, when you learned that your father was alive, what was your initial reaction? I was furious. I thought he had known about me and chosen not to be part of my life. It wasn't until I learned the truth about Agent Warner that I understood what had really happened. The defense tried to suggest that Emma had been better off without me, that single-parent families could be just as stable as two-parent families. Ms. Mitchell, your mother provided you with a good life, didn't she? You received an excellent education. You became a successful nurse. You're a well-adjusted adult. Yes, my mother gave me everything she could, but she couldn't give me a father. And that absence affected every aspect of my development. On the fifth day, the prosecution presented evidence about Warner's other victims, the women who had been held at his Nevada compound, the families that had been destroyed by his manipulation. Sarah Kellerman, who had been imprisoned by Warner for over 30 years, testified about the psychological control he had exerted over her life. He convinced me that my family had forgotten about me, that the outside world was dangerous, that he was the only person who cared about my safety. Jennifer Martinez described how Warner had gradually isolated her from all outside contact until she became completely dependent on him for information about the world. He told me that my children had been killed by the people I had testified against. For 25 years, I believed my children were dead when they were actually searching for me. The testimonies from Warner's other victims established a clear pattern of manipulation and control that had been consistent across multiple cases over 4 decades. On the 6th day, Warner himself took the witness stand in his own defense. Agent Warner, why did you maintain contact with protected witnesses after their official protection ended? Because the threats against them never really end. Once you testify against organized crime, you're marked for life. I was trying to provide ongoing protection that the system couldn't offer. But under cross-examination by Prosecutor Walsh, Warner's true motivations became clear. Agent Warner, isn't it true that you told Mrs. Mitchell her husband was dating other women when... That was completely false. I may have been mistaken about some details. Agent Warner, isn't it true that you intercepted Mrs. Mitchell's attempts to research her husband's well-being? I was protecting operational security. Agent Warner, isn't it true that you developed romantic feelings for Mrs. Mitchell and used your federal authority to keep her isolated and dependent on you? Warner's composure finally cracked. I cared about Isabella. I wanted to protect her. You wanted to possess her, didn't you, Agent Warner? I wanted her to be safe and happy. Safe and happy or available and dependent on you. Warner's inability to provide convincing answers to Walsh's questions revealed the obsession and selfishness that had motivated his decades of manipulation. The most damaging moment came when Walsh showed Warner photographs from his Nevada compound. The locked rooms, the surveillance equipment, the personal belongings of women he had imprisoned. Agent Warner, how do you explain holding multiple women against their will while telling them they were being protected? They were being protected. The outside world was dangerous for them. Agent Warner, Sarah Kellerman was held in your compound for 31 years. What threat could possibly justify 3 decades of imprisonment? Warner had no answer that could justify the scope of his crimes. After 6 days of testimony, closing arguments began. Walsh summarized the prosecution's case, clearly and powerfully. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Warner used federal authority to kidnap and imprison vulnerable women for his own personal gratification. He destroyed families, stole decades of happiness, and violated every principle of justice and protection he was sworn to uphold. The Mitchell family lost 22 years together because Warner decided that Linda Mitchell belonged to him rather than to her husband and daughter. The defense's closing argument tried to portray Warner as a flawed but well-intentioned agent whose methods had been extreme, but whose motivations had been pure. Thomas Warner devoted his life to protecting people who had nowhere else to turn. His actions may have caused pain, but they also saved lives. But after hearing 6 days of evidence about Warner's systematic manipulation and abuse, the jury wasn't convinced by the defense's arguments. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. On the charge of kidnapping in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of false imprisonment, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of abuse of federal authority, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty. As the guilty verdicts were read, Warner showed no emotion. But when he was led away in handcuffs, he looked directly at Linda one final time with an expression that combined obsession with defeat. Linda reached for my hand and squeezed it tightly. "It's over, Bobby. He can't hurt anyone else." Emma was crying with relief. "Dad, Mom, we can finally move forward without him controlling our lives." 2 weeks later, Warner was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Patricia Morrison explained her reasoning clearly. "Mr. Warner, you used federal authority to commit crimes that destroyed multiple families over 4 decades. Your actions were not misguided attempts at protection. They were systematic abuse designed to satisfy your own obsessive desires. The Mitchell family will never recover the 22 years you stole from them. Emma Mitchell will never recover the childhood with her father that you took from her. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without parole and recommends that you be held in solitary confinement to prevent you from manipulating other inmates or prison personnel." As we left the courthouse after Warner's sentencing, Linda, Emma, and I walked out together as a family, something we hadn't been able to do for 22 years. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "Now we go home," I said, "and we start living the life we should have had all along." The trial was over, but our real work as a family was just beginning. 3 months after Warner's sentencing, we faced the most important conversation of our reunion, not about the past, but about our future together. Linda, Emma and I sat in our living room in Pine Valley, the same room where Linda and I had planned our dreams 44 years ago, trying to decide how to build a life together after everything we'd been through. "I need to ask you both something," Linda said, her voice steady but serious. "Do you really want me in your lives, or do you feel obligated to forgive me because of what Warner did?" The question had been weighing on all of us since the trial ended. While Warner's manipulation explained the circumstances of our separation, it didn't erase the choices Linda had made or the consequences we'd all lived with. "Mom, what do you mean?" "Emma, I need to know if you can genuinely forgive me for the childhood I stole from you, or if you're just being kind because you feel sorry for me." Emma was quiet for a long moment, considering her mother's question. Carefully, "Mom, I'm angry about the years we lost. I'm sad about not having a father growing up. But I'm not angry at you anymore. I'm angry at the situation, at Warner, at the circumstances that forced you to make an impossible choice. And Bobby, I need to know if you can really love me again, or if you're just trying to honor the memory of who I used to be." I looked at this woman who had shared my life for 22 years, who had suffered in isolation for 22 more years, who was now asking me to choose her again. "Linda, I need to be honest with you about something. You're not the same person I married in 1980. Linda's face fell slightly. "I know. I've been changed by everything that happened. But I'm not the same person either. 22 years of grief changed me in ways I'm still discovering. The question isn't whether we can recapture what we had. It's whether we can build something new based on who we are now. And can we?" I reached for Linda's hand, the same hand I'd held through 22 years of marriage and mourned for 22 years of widowhood. "Linda, I fell in love with you again during these past few months. Not with the memory of who you were, but with the person you are now. You're stronger, more independent, more thoughtful than you were when we were young, even knowing that I chose to let you suffer rather than trust you with the truth. Especially knowing that you made the hardest choice imaginable to protect the people you loved. That takes a kind of strength I never had to develop," Emma spoke up. "Mum, can I ask you something?" "Of course. If you could go back to 2002 and make the choice again, knowing everything you know now, what would you do?" Linda considered the question carefully. "If I knew then what I know now about Warner's manipulation, about your father's unwillingness to move on, about the emotional cost to all of us, I would have told your father the truth and trusted him to help us face the danger together. But if you had only the information you had then I would make the same choice again. Emma, I would rather have you grow up without a father than not grow up at all." Emma nodded. "Then I forgive you completely. You made the best decision you could with the information you had, motivated by love for Dad and me. Emma, there's something else I need to tell you both. Something I've been afraid to admit." Linda's voice became very quiet, and I could see her gathering courage for something difficult. "What is it, sweetheart?" "Part of me is glad that I was forced to fake my death." Emma and I stared at Linda in shock. "Mom, what do you mean?" "I mean that living as Margaret Santos for 22 years taught me things about myself that I never would have learned as Linda Mitchell." Linda explained that the years of independence, of raising Emma alone, of building a career and identity separate from anyone else's expectations, had given her a strength and self-knowledge she'd never possessed before. "When I was young, Linda, I defined myself through my relationships as Vincent Rossi's daughter, then as Bobby's wife. I never really knew who I was as an individual person, and now you do. Now I know that I'm strong enough to survive anything. I know that I can build a life and raise a daughter and maintain hope, even under the worst circumstances." Linda looked at both of us with an expression of complete honesty. I'm not glad that we were separated. I'm not glad that you suffered or that Emma grew up without her father. But I am glad that I discovered I was capable of surviving on my own. Linda, how does that affect what you want for our future? It means that I'm choosing to be here not because I need you, but because I want you. It means that our relationship can be based on mutual choice rather than dependency. Emma smiled. Mom, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. I don't want you to need us. I want you to choose us. And I want both of you to choose me, not out of obligation or guilt, but because you genuinely want me in your lives. I looked at Linda and Emma, these two strong women who had survived decades of separation and manipulation, and felt something I hadn't experienced since 1980, complete confidence in our family's future. Linda, Emma, I choose both of you every day, not because I have to, but because loving you is the best part of who I am. Emma reached for both our hands. I choose both of you too. And for the first time in my life, I feel like I have a complete family. Linda squeezed our hands tightly. Then that's what we'll build. A family based on choice, honesty, and the knowledge that we're strong enough to survive anything together. As we sat together in our living room, I realized that our story wasn't about recovering from loss. It was about choosing love despite impossible circumstances. We had lost 22 years to lies and manipulation, but we had found each other, again through truth and forgiveness. Warner had tried to destroy our family by separating us. Instead, he had ultimately strengthened us by teaching us that real love survives any obstacle, and that families are built not just by blood and history, but by daily choices to love and support each other. So what do we do now? Emma asked. Now, we live, Linda said. We make up for lost time by making the most of the time we have left. Together? Together. As the sun set outside our window, casting golden light across the room where Linda and I had planned our future so many years ago, I realized that some stories don't have happy endings. They have happy beginnings. Our real life as a family was just starting. 1 year later, I stood in the same Methodist church where Linda and I had been married 44 years ago, watching her walk down the aisle toward me for the second time in our lives. But this wasn't a renewal of our old vows. This was something completely new. Emma walked beside her mother, not giving her away, but standing with her as they both joined me at the altar where Reverend Martinez was waiting to perform a ceremony we'd designed ourselves. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today not to witness a traditional wedding, but to celebrate the creation of a family that has survived separation, manipulation, and 22 years of loss to find each other again. Linda wore a simple blue dress, her favorite color, and carried a bouquet of daisies that Emma had picked from the garden we'd planted together in our backyard. I wore my best suit, the same one I'd worn to court during Warner's trial. But today, it represented hope instead of justice. Emma stood beside us in a yellow sundress, holding the rings that would symbolize our commitment not just to each other, but to the family we were choosing to build together. Bobby, Linda, Emma, you have written your own vows for this ceremony. Bobby, would you like to begin? I looked at Linda, seeing in her face not just the young woman I'd married in 1980, but the survivor who had endured decades of isolation to protect our family. Linda, 44 years ago, I promised to love you in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, until death do us part. Death did part us, but love brought us back together. Today, I'm making a different promise. I promise to love you not as the woman you were, but as the woman you are. I promise to build a future with you that honors our past but isn't limited by it. I promise to trust you with the truth, always, even when the truth is difficult. And I promise to choose you every day, not because I have to, but because choosing you is the best decision I've ever made. Linda wiped tears from her eyes as she responded, Bobby, 22 years ago, I made the hardest choice of my life when I let you believe I was dead. Today, I'm making the easiest choice of my life by choosing to spend whatever years we have left together. I promise to never again make decisions about our family without trusting you to help me face whatever challenges we encounter. I promise to be honest about who I am now, not who I used to be, and I promise to love you not just as my first love, but as my last love, my choice for whatever time we have remaining. Emma stepped forward with our rings, simple gold bands that we'd chosen together, engraved with the date of our reunion rather than our original wedding. Mom, Dad, these rings represent the family we're choosing to create together. They represent forgiveness, hope, and the understanding that love is stronger than any circumstance. As we exchanged rings, I felt something I hadn't experienced since 1980, complete confidence in our future together, by the power vested in me and in the presence of this community that loves and supports you. I now pronounce you husband and wife and daughter, a family united by choice, strengthened by survival, and committed to loving each other through whatever comes next. The reception was small but perfect. Our neighbors from Pine Valley, Linda's colleagues from the hospital in Riverside, Emma's friends who had become our extended family, and even Agent Rodriguez and Agent Chen, who had helped us find justice and closure. My sister Margaret had flown in from Phoenix with her family, meeting Linda for the first time in 22 years, and getting to know Emma, the niece she'd never known existed. Bobby, Linda looks exactly the same, Margaret told me during the reception. It's like she's been frozen in time. She's been through more than any of us can imagine, but she's stronger for it. And Emma is remarkable. She has your sense of humor and Linda's compassion. She's everything Linda and I could have hoped for in a daughter. During the reception, Emma gave a speech that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Most people give speeches at weddings about the couple finding each other. Today, I want to talk about a family that never really lost each other, even when they thought they had. My parents spent 22 years apart, but they never stopped loving each other. I spent 22 years without my father, but I never stopped carrying his values and character. What we learned is that family isn't just about being together. It's about carrying each other in your heart, even when you're apart. Today isn't just about my parents getting married again. It's about all of us choosing to be a family, choosing to love each other, choosing to make up for lost time by making the most of the time we have. Mom, Dad, thank you for showing me that real love survives anything and that it's never too late to choose happiness. As the evening wound down and our guests began to leave, Linda, Emma, and I stood together on the church steps, looking out at the town where Linda and I had built our first life together and where we were now building our second. Any regrets? Linda asked. About what? About choosing to start over with a 72-year-old man instead of finding someone younger. I laughed. Linda, I'm 72. If you found someone younger, I'd be jealous. Emma hugged both of us. I love that you two are still ridiculous together. What about you, Emma? Any regrets about suddenly having parents when you're 24 years old? My only regret is that it took so long. But Dad, Mom, I want you to know that getting to be your daughter has been the best experience of my life. As we drove home that evening, to the house where Linda and I would grow old together, where Emma would visit with the family she would someday create, where we would build new memories to balance the ones we'd lost, I realized that our story had become something I'd never expected. We weren't just survivors of a tragedy. We were proof that love is stronger than circumstance, that families can be rebuilt even after they've been destroyed, and that sometimes the best chapters of your life are the ones you never expected to write. Linda reached over and took my hand. As we pulled into our driveway, Bobby, do you think Margaret would approve of how our story turned out? I thought about my first wife, the woman who had loved Linda like a daughter and who had always believed that good things happen to people who made sacrificial choices. Linda, I think Margaret would be proud of the woman you became during our separation, proud of the daughter you raised alone, and proud of the family we've chosen to rebuild together. Do you think she would understand why I made the choices I made? I think Margaret would understand that love sometimes requires impossible choices, and that the best we can do is choose based on love rather than fear. Emma spoke from the back seat. I think Grandma Margaret would be happy that her family is together again. As we walked into our house that night, Linda, Emma, and I together for the first time as a complete family, I felt something I hadn't experienced since 1980. Complete peace about the future. We had lost 22 years, but we had gained something more valuable. The knowledge that our love was strong enough to survive anything, and that family is defined not by circumstances, but by choices. Thomas Warner had tried to destroy us by separating us. Instead, he had ultimately strengthened us by teaching us that real families are built on trust, honesty, and the daily choice to love each other despite any obstacle. At 72, I was starting the best chapter of my life with the woman I'd loved for 44 years and the daughter I'd never expected to know. Some stories don't end, they just begin again, stronger and wiser than before. Linda was alive. Emma was ours, and we had the rest of our lives to make up for the time Warner had stolen from us. Looking back now, I realized that the most important day of my life wasn't my 50th birthday when I thought I buried my wife. It was my 72nd birthday when I discovered that love really can survive anything, and that the best families are the ones that choose each other every single day.